a sacred gland. Truly, you're blessed, foundling. That gland contains the true nectar, the most precious sacrament. Each drop holds both transcendence and transfigurement. Rare is the soul brave enough to extract such an offering. I'm afraid I'm no longer fit for such work. The rite of extraction requires deeply pious hands.
Alright, time to carefully perform the rite with our deeply pious hands. It's been a long time since I've waded into the Dark Souls clone pool. The last time I did a video on a game of this genre was probably Ashen, which at this point was about a year ago. Mortal Shell seemed like a great time to get back on the horse though, because not only does it look impressive, but it has some pretty great twists on the core game design of the Souls-like. And it's also an extremely good example of how an experienced dev team limits scope to make sure a game can actually be completed. I'm going to be getting into this game in quite a bit of detail, probably more detail than I've gotten into with another game for a while, because I really enjoyed my time with it, and I have a lot to say about some of the more minor details. That being said, you should probably go into this video expecting a lot of spoilers. If you want the quick and dirty review, I can tell you this. Mortal Shell is a very well polished, competent Souls-like that makes up for its relatively short length with extremely high quality. It isn't a full-priced release, so I don't think that the length should be enough to scare you off, especially since there is room for a couple playthroughs. All that being said, if you don't plan on playing Mortal Shell, or you've already finished it and you're looking to have your terrible opinions validated, carry on with the rest of this video. In Mortal Shell, you play as this weird ghoul. As a weird ghoul myself, it's nice to finally see some representation in video games. One of the game's main gimmicks is, rather than playing as the weird ghoul all the time, you can possess the bodies of dead people with different sets of stats and abilities to unlock. So instead of the traditional approach of having some kind of stat system or something to decide what kind of build or playstyle you're going for, Mortal Shell essentially has a few pre-made builds for you to choose depending on what your plan is. Do you want to be a big man with big health? Do you want a more balanced approach? Or do you just want to throw health in the garbage and bank on stamina and mobility? Personally, I prefer a more meticulous stat system to this option, but it's important for a small studio like Cold Symmetry to limit their scope while developing a game like this, to avoid getting too ambitious and developing themselves into a hole they can't get out of, so I get why they went with something a little bit more streamlined. I'll get into exactly what I mean by the scope of this game being limited later, because it's going to involve most of this video's spoilers, and I know about 200 people ignored my spoiler warning and would get mad if I dropped spoilers this early. So, for now, let's take a look at the game's combat system in some detail, because these games are extremely heavily combat-driven. By now, pretty much everyone on Earth is familiar with the type of heavy combat you get in this genre of game. You have a light attack, you have a strong attack, you can dodge and roll, you need to commit to an attack at the correct time, and so on and so forth. Mortal Shell, however, has one key gimmick that makes this whole system a little bit more interesting. In Mortal Shell, you play as Metapod. Your character has the ability to instantly harden into stone at any point during any animation. This ability is obviously on a short cooldown to prevent you from being invincible, but it allows you to do some pretty stylish moves, since you can harden in the middle of an attack animation to block and then follow through immediately. Now, if you have a small brain like me, you might be thinking, oh, so the harden system is Mortal Shell's version of the parry system. And, like me, you would be wrong. The parry system is Mortal Shell's version of the parry system. So then what is the harden system? Harden actually takes the place of any ability your character has to block. You won't find any shields in this game, and you can't block with a weapon. Which is so genius, I'm going to have to spend a couple of minutes talking about it. The problem with blocking, either with a shield or with a weapon in the Souls series or similar games, has always been it just sort of slows down the gameplay. That's why when you watch someone who is more experienced with these types of games, they'll usually disregard even using a shield and prefer to make use of parries, sidesteps, or dodging into a counterattack, rather than picking the slower option of blocking. This is also why in a game like Bloodborne, where the developers wanted players to move more quickly and be more aggressive, the ability to block was not only removed from the game, but outright ridiculed. What Mortal Shell has managed to do is give the player an option that is essentially a block that doesn't slow down how the game flows, because it not only doesn't interrupt or require its own animations, but it can be seamlessly integrated with any other animation in the game, meaning you can play a defensive move simultaneous to an aggressive move. The cooldown also means that players can't just hide behind a stamina bar for the entire fight and need to actually engage with the enemy's attack pattern eventually. The parry system also took steps to improve the way the basic formula works. First, in order to even parry in the first place, you need some of this yellow bar here, which the game calls resolve, in order for it to be the most effective. Resolve builds up over time as you fight, and sometimes under other circumstances, depending on which shell you're playing as. If you have enough resolve, you can pull off a familiar looking parry and riposte. The only real difference being you can choose which type of riposte you want for different effects. The first one heals you, the second one you get deals higher damage, that sort of thing. The part of the system that makes major improvements though is the seal on your character's back that is used to deflect attacks will flash a warning if the incoming attack can't be parried. Which means some of the guesswork is taken out of attempting to pull off a risky parry, and you're encouraged more to play with a parry-heavy style, because you know for sure what can and cannot be parried during any given fight. Second, since ripostes are gated behind a resource system, players can't really abuse ripostes to trivialize combat, which is good and allows for the system to be used on bosses in a more reasonable way, and generally balances out combat encounters a little bit more. The next bit of praise I'm going to throw towards the game in terms of its combat is how great the animations and general feel of the combat is. First of all, attack animations for swords actually include half-hand techniques and an attack that includes the hilt of the blade, which you probably wouldn't see unless the animators and or developers were actually researching how longsword fencing historically worked. That's the kind of really small detail that should tip you off on the fact that you're dealing with a great developer that is going to put time into details other people probably wouldn't. The next bit is sort of hard to quantify, but the animations just look and feel incredible. The timing on how your attacks land, and the death animations of enemies, and just generally how combat looks and flows, creates a really amazing feeling of actually grounded, semi-realistic combat. It seems like most animations were designed specifically to flow into each other in a way you don't typically see. The only problem I had with the weapon system comes from weapon abilities. Every weapon in the game can unlock 2 abilities. Using them requires resolve. The problem here is that there weren't very many times where I felt like using weapon abilities was that important, and when I did, the resolve cost usually made the cost seem like it outweighed the benefits. For one, you also need resolve to pull off parries, and since one of the best ways to heal or take down more dangerous enemies is with a riposte, you usually feel like you need to save your resolve for that. Blowing 2 or 3 bars of resolve felt like a high price, but I get why the price is high, otherwise you would just be spamming these abilities non-stop. The other issue is that resolve is sort of a semi-precious resource. Even when I was playing as Solomon, the shell that has the specific gimmick of being able to get resolve more quickly, I always felt like I was never really keeping up with the resolve meter. So you sort of want to save your weapon abilities for emergencies, but they also don't really feel powerful enough to be emergency only. I mean, they work, and being able to do stuff like freeze enemies for a second to reposition is nice, but the entire system just felt a little bit awkward. I think maybe it would have been better to make resolve a little bit easier to get and make weapon abilities a little bit weaker so they could be used more often or something. I never really found myself making use of the system, which is unfortunate because the animations and the sound design are awesome. This isn't really an issue in the broader context of the game, though. It just felt a little off. Basically, the combat in Mortal Shell is fantastic, and not only delivers on the experience of a Souls clone that we've all come to expect, but actually makes an effort to solve some of the problems and improve on the old formula, most of which are extremely successful. There's also a big-ass shoulder-mounted crossbow. Time to transition to level design. Mortal Shell's game world is very, very well made. For one, it actually feels finished. There's never a time where I was in an area in this game where I felt like the developers had to cut content or something along those lines. This is because that whole limiting scope thing heavily came into play here as well. Areas are just non-linear enough to not feel boring, but just linear enough to not feel like a frustrating labyrinth. It's a very well achieved balance. Everything is tightly and intentionally designed, and it's very obvious a lot of intricate planning went into designing each area of the game. Obviously, you're also incentivized to explore in a few ways. For one, exploration will reward you with items, and you're never really told where to go, so you're sort of forced to explore on your own to progress anyway. But this is all kind of to be expected at this point. Saying a game in this genre heavily features exploration is sort of like saying a first-person shooter heavily features a crosshair. Where things actually get interesting is how Mortal Shell leverages its more linear world design into something kind of fresh. And this is your final warning to avoid enormous spoilers. Here is a diagram of what this game's map looks like. You'll notice that it has a central area that branches off into 3 sub-areas, each of which is split into 2 halves. It's a very neat and clean design. The object of Mortal Shell is essentially to go into each of these 3 areas, kill the boss, steal his goo, and get back to the hub in the main area. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, if each of these 3 branches are so linear, isn't this going to be extremely boring and half of the game is backtracking? Well, luckily for us, the Mortal Shell team had the exact same thought and fixed this before it became a problem. Once you manage to get to the end of the area, kill the boss, and steal the goo, things get a little bit more complicated. This thick fog rolls in, enemy spawns change, and the map will also slightly change to throw off your navigation in the fog even more. Typically, enemy spawns and placement, when this fog is present, will be more numerous and a little bit more difficult. Now, instead of just backtracking through the area you just completed, you are sort of playing an escape mission in that area with the difficulty ramped up. And there is some variety in rotating between the fog zone and the normal game map that keeps you on your toes instead of just being straight up backtracking. Or some kind of fast travel system that would cut the game's runtime in half. The other success of level design is that the checkpoint system being unforgiving makes up for the combat being relatively forgiving in an interesting kind of way. Combat in Mortal Shell is, I would say, on the easier end of the spectrum as far as this genre goes. Harden is a pretty versatile panic button. The first time you die, you get knocked out of your shell and have a chance to get back into your body, so you sort of have 2 lives, and there is even an ability all shells can unlock that gives you a chance to regain your extra life. So, theoretically, you shouldn't die that often if you're familiar with how these games work. The catch is that most areas in the game are structured to have a checkpoint at the beginning and a checkpoint at the end. So if you do die, you are pretty heavily punished by being sent back to the start of an area most of the time. This means that even though the combat feels kind of easy, it's still tense because you really don't want to get slam dunked back to the mask waifu and have to hike back to your stupid corpse. The entire dynamic between the checkpoints and the difficulty of combat is a great example of showing how the team behind this game actually understands the idea of hard but fair, which is generally thought to be what makes this genre good. Pretty much every time I died in Mortal Shell, it was because I read an enemy attack wrong, or ran into a group I shouldn't have run into, or otherwise made a mistake I shouldn't have made. It always feels like you deserve to get sent back, which is actually a pretty difficult accomplishment in a video game. The one issue I had with level design is that I found these crawl spaces a little confusing. Sometimes they're used as shortcuts, sometimes they're used to access separate areas, so it's kind of inconsistent and you never know what to expect when you find one. They are pretty useful once you memorize which one goes where, but my soup brain just found it easier to navigate the world normally most of the time. I'm not really sure this counts as a mark against the game though, more so a mark against my dyslexia. Those are most of my big game design notes for Mortal Shell, but there are some smaller notes I would kind of like to lightning round real fast. First, Mortal Shell is just generally extremely polished. If it wasn't for its relatively small amount of content, it would be very easy to mistake it for a AAA game. For example, kicking around loot during a fight will play goofy string noises. There's all sorts of small details like this. Bosses are generally designed really well. They have fun patterns to learn and feel like intense duels. I think I'm supposed to make a Total Recall joke about this guy, but I lost that part of my notes. As far as small gripes go, items kind of seemed not that useful most of the time. For example, these scriptures give your parry additional effects, but only on your next riposte, which means that you need to use the item, land the parry, and have enough resolve for the riposte, all to get one effect, one time, which just seemed like kind of a hassle to me. The Ballista Zuka also looks absolutely terrible. It's very awkwardly attached to your back and doesn't have any secondary animation to sell it actually being attached to you, which I guess is fitting because depending on what shell you're playing, it literally isn't. Both of these points are kind of just me whining, though. The next thing I need to talk about is probably the game's plot, story, and world building, or as the Souls community would say, its lore. Mortal Shell does a couple pretty cool things in this department. Right off the bat, the game opens with you crawling through this cave that does some weird MC Escher shit to show you immediately that you're crawling into a place that isn't going to be bound to your idea of how reality should work, without giving you a single line of text or dialogue. I always appreciate visual storytelling like this. Mortal Shell takes the idea of the item description lore bits to a new level by including a familiarity system that will give you more information the more familiar you are with an item. Meaning that you need to not only find every item to get all your juicy text lines, but you need to use them multiple times to become familiar enough to really get all the information. Which should, theoretically, add something of an item hunt aspect for players that really want to unlock every single paragraph of Fantasy Babble. The game's tutorial for how this system works is also genius. At the start of the game, you get this lute, which you can always use to play a song. The description says, "Practice makes perfect," and every time you use it, your familiarity increases, and your character starts to play better and learn different songs. This shows you, without ever actually telling you, that increasing familiarity is good and will make items do different, better things. Of course, in true Souls fashion, some of the best stuff comes from NPC interactions. First, Mortal Shell does an interesting thing where you sort of are playing as an NPC, which sounds insane until I explain it. Technically, the player character is the ghoul, and the guy he's piloting around like a bone mech are different characters. The world of Mortal Shell is all about people trying to steal and feed on the memories of others, and as you unlock new abilities for each shell, you get a voiceover of the shell talking about their past life, which usually reveals more about them as a person or the world in general.
The brigands fell upon us with crude knives. Trailing blood, I stumbled into a cavern. Deep within, a priest welcomed me, clutching a tablet. He promised I would be reborn within the shadow of the revered. But he could do nothing for my injuries.
Additionally, a few of the NPCs around the game will address you differently if they remember who the shell you are wearing used to be.
You wear a familiar face, or should I say, a distinct lack thereof. Where did you find him, foundling? Do not answer. Just come closer. It's a simple pleasure to glimpse my beloved. Even if he's truly gone, some part of him remains with you. A small consolation, but I shall accept this mercy. Would it please your withered lips to taste my gifts once again?
Which is a nice touch, and offers a little bit of replayability, since sometimes you'll get new dialogue lines you've never heard before. Mortal Shell also does the classic Souls grift of never really telling you who the good guy is. Sure, this lady might seem like she's helping you, but if there's anything I learned from playing Magic, it's that if a lady wearing a porcelain mask is telling you to sip the divine tar, it's usually bad. Lore analysis isn't really my thing, but if you're one of the big lore nerds of this genre, I think there should be a couple lines of text in here you can really grab onto and expand into a 45-minute video. Finally, it's time for me to loop way back around and talk about that whole limited scope thing I mentioned. What do I mean by limited scope? Well, usually, when a less experienced developer team is trying to make a game like Mortal Shell, they might think something like, okay, so we have this game idea, and we're gonna have like 10 different shells, and there will be 8 big bosses, and like 30 weapons, and the game will be 150 hours of runtime. And then very quickly, the team realizes that there is literally no way they can get a game this ambitious out on time, or ever, and a lot of content gets cut, things get rushed, delayed, or never released at all. Mortal Shell manages to dodge this bullet by understanding that ambition is the enemy of greatness and chilling the fuck out. Mortal Shell said, okay, we're only gonna have 5 shells and like 4-ish bosses and 4 weapons, and the game will only run about 15 hours or so, but we are going to make sure that 15 hours is rock solid. This is how you can tell that when Cold Symmetry claims to be made up of AAA veterans, they aren't bullshitting. They knew exactly what their limits were, and exactly how much game they could realistically make with their team, and still maintain a level of visual quality and polish you would see in some AAA releases. Some people will be put off by the game's lack of content, but at the end of the day, this wasn't a full-priced release, and it still has 15 to 25 hours of gameplay, depending on if you decide to tackle New Game Plus or not, so I think it's reasonable, especially with how much quality you're getting. Mortal Shell is an expertly designed game by very good developers that seem to have genuinely studied and improved on the genre of game they wanted to make. If you're interested in a relatively short, but extremely well-executed Souls-like, then Mortal Shell is absolutely worth a purchase. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. You should also follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. I've also got a link down in the description to join my Discord. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.